I guess what I wanted to talk about this week is you're diving into this idea of attack surface management and ASM because it's been interesting. We've been doing this for a long time now. We're like 6 years into the business, and we were doing this well before attack surface management was a thing. We were one of the first in that space, and it's been interesting to see how it's kind of evolved, and how it differs from how we've thought about it. It's it's interesting because for us, at least, ASM has been about, um, I guess, sort of the core principles that we started with, coming from the bug bounty space a little bit, right? It needs to be, holistic, continuous, and focused on finding, exposure, security exposures. The core principle that we had was asset discovery was never the end in and of itself, right? Like we used to say that all the time. It was like, what do you want to do with that? And it feels like the market's kind of focused a little bit more purely on discovery, and less on the exposure management side. And it's been kind of interesting to see how that has evolved and the kinds of different tools, I guess, and products that have spawned up in this space, and how people, both from a company perspective, but also from like an engineering perspective, think about ASM. I remember I'm much older than you, Shubs, but I remember like in the early days, um, uh, back when I started my career, that like I was working for pen test companies, and every pen test company would have this service called footprint, or digital footprint or external footprint or something like that. And it was basically like a 1-2 week engagement of you know mapping out your external attack surface, and providing a list of assets effectively at the end of it. That's been around for like 20 odd years almost, and now like every single security testing company that does that exact same service calls it attack surface management, which is very different to the kind of in-depth engineering that we do to build like a continuous and automated product. And so I wanted to dive into that kind of idea a little bit more in terms of how that kind of has evolved, and also thinking about what is ASM at its core, and can you utilize these sorts of off the shelf tools and these open source tools to be effective or not. So that's sort of where I wanted to start. Do you have any kind of thoughts from your perspective on how that sort of term, I guess, has sort of evolved since we started?
Yeah, I do think that it's like when I look back at it, I am a little bit, I guess, a little bit proud that I think we really made a movement in ASM when we started, and we were focused really on vulnerabilities and exposures generally. I do feel that a lot of companies have kind of converged into this idea that we do need to find exposures, not just find the assets. But I agree with you. I mean, there's so much variance in the term. I mean, there's companies that are kind of like dashboard companies. There's companies that just collect assets. There's companies that focus on graphs. There's companies that are just focusing on connectors and things. So it's wild, and they all call themselves ASMs, right? To be honest,
There's companies that don't even do what I would consider ASM that call
right?
themselves ASM. I was
Yeah,
reading a TechCrunch article not too long ago, and it was like a typical like, hey, PR, obviously PR sponsored kind of thing. Such and such company took X in a Series A, and it was like attack surface management takes X Series A round, and I'm like, okay, like, oh, let's check this out. I'll look into it. And the article's talking about attack surface management, how important attack surface management is. And so I'm like, okay, who's this company? So I click onto their website, and there's not a single mention of the words attack surface management. It's a container security company. It was a company that was, kind of automatically, removing like unused dependencies and other things like that that's installed in these sort of containers. And and I guess from some level you could call that like reducing your attack surface, but to call that attack surface management is a huge leap. And it was quite interesting because it had nothing to do with their product, and nothing to do with what as varied as it is, the rest of the market considers ASM in any way, not even like asset discovery, right? Yet this article and this sort of VCs, I assume, we're really using it as this kind of buzzword term, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think the amount of variance that we have in this field with the term ASM is actually causing kind of a disservice to the general people who are looking to get into this field or buy a product in this field, because they often don't actually know what a real ASM is or what a true ASM is until they see one. And that's sometimes they may not even see one, and they might just resign and say, okay, this dashboard company or whatever is giving me all my assets. That means I've got a management of I'm able to manage my attack surface. But that's not really what ASM means, at least not to us.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I often find is, there's I feel like in the last couple of years, there's been like this emergence in this open source space, and generally with people trying to claim that you don't need an ASM from a vendor, you can build it yourself with off the shelf open source tools. And I also think that's a little bit of a disservice, because it really doesn't go towards what we believe the core pillars of ASM are and what you need to be able to actually manage your attack surface. And I it's difficult because there are a lot of people in the industry that may not come from an engineering background or may not come from a offensive security background, that may not understand what is really required to manage your attack surface from a workflow perspective, from an exposure discovery perspective, from an asset discovery perspective.
And even just
And
from the raw engineering of making that happen as well, and I
right.
think.
And yeah, I mean, I often, I don't know about you, but I often find that people, and I don't know if this is just based on a few experiences I've had, but people often don't understand what goes on behind the scenes to build an ASM that's actually capable of doing what it says
Yeah,
and what it's supposed to do.
we
Um,
get that a lot. I mean, like in the very early days, we got, why you're building out asset discovery. Why are you building your own exposure monitoring engine, right? Why don't you just white label some scanner? And it's like, it doesn't work for what we need it to do. And like, we have a very specific vision of basically real time monitoring of your external attack surface, and it, that's a huge, as you said, like behind the scenes kind of engineering effort to meet that standard. And like, we're very focused on that standard. And, we do that most, only because there's like so much value that comes from it. But I agree with your point that the market is, this is the sort of the rhetoric out there in the market has led to a lot of confusion for buyers, right? Not just from the commercial sense, right, but also in the even in this concept, like you're sort of saying, of the build versus buy element, right? I don't think they really understand, what it is, or they don't have a good picture of what it is to sort of build and maintain this, to get a standard. And it's kind of interesting, where we hear it, very often with our the people that we speak to, the companies that we speak to, where they'll say like, we've looked at 4, 5, 6 vendors in the market, and then they heard about us, and they sort of said, we were ready to give up on this project. The state of the market is terrible. And then they sort of see us, and they have comments like, oh, this is what I was thinking of when I thought of ASM. This is what I was kind of looking for. And so this is the element where ASM is kind of really loosely defined by various marketing groups, as well as analyst firms, I guess. And it's creating this confusion. But like, there is still a sense of, what they were hoping to get. I think, there is something more fundamental to it, right? It's like, what they're looking for is that kind of complete visibility into, the attack surface, not just what the attack surface is, but what are the exposures and the problems inside the attack surface, and what do they need to do about it. Um, and so, once you have that kind of understanding, it kind of, obviously there's, they can evaluate different vendors and, look at the pros and cons and do POCs. But I think an interesting kind of element of that is how it influences the kind of build versus buy kind of decision making that's typical at a lot of companies, right? Particularly those that maybe have a stronger engineering culture. And they'll look at, like you said, there's a bunch of open source tools, doing various components of what you might consider ASM. And they think, oh well, that's easy. I'll just run these guys. I'll just run these tools. I'll just string them together. But it doesn't really work effectively, right? Um,
Yeah, and the reason it doesn't work is because if you want to hit any of the same levels of continuous scanning or the scale that you may need to hit in most cases, as well as quality and output and workflows, that stuff doesn't exist. So, I mean, unless you go with an actual vendor, I feel like these days you're not going to be able to get those additional benefits. And even then, some of these vendors at the end of the day are just gluing things together anyways. Like, how many vendors do we speak to and they're like, oh, we just glued this tool and this tool and that's how we get this. And it's like,
yeah,
yeah, you're not going to actually get the quality from that. So
yeah,
there is definitely an element of that. But, I think that one of the things that people can, really often do when it comes to ASM, which is what I've seen, is grossly underestimate the difficulty of reliable scanning and quality output, because
yeah.
that's the two things that I think are reliable scanning and discovery and quality output. I think these things are probably the most difficult things when it comes to building an ASM. But yeah, I don't know. I
So,
see
so
this a
let's dive
lot.
into that, right? Like, so let's dive into like the scale side of it. You know,
Mm,
thinking of scale both from a discovery perspective and exposure scanning perspective, and what it takes to engineer that. I think what's kind of interesting as well is there's so many different people that get into this space and sort of like you said, glue tools together and think, hey, like I've got a product that I can sell. But there's often not a lot of core value there when you think about our history, right? You know, a lot of the ideas around this came well before Astronaut was even formed 6 years ago, and it came from actually doing this, right? Actually, looking at large attack surfaces and trying to find exposures, from a bug bounty perspective, right? And so
yeah,
there's a lot of putting engineering aside, there's even just a lot of like really nuanced elements to that you only really get from experience,
yeah,
that we've had from the beginning, that you sometimes see people talking about that, and it's just like you know you know 3 years into them starting a company and they still haven't solved that problem that we had sort of solved from day dot, because we knew it was a problem from day dot. And that's kind of interesting. But on the engineering side, talk me through how you think about the scale and the challenges with the scalability, because you're right. I hear it as well, where oh well, I guess it's easy to build this, right? You just take this tool and then you just pipe it to this tool and then you just put some sort of pretty interface on it, and there you go, Bob's your uncle, you've got an ASM. But it's really not as simple if you're trying to get effective value for the end user, right? And so talk me through some of the scale challenges.
yeah. And I guess one of the things I will quickly clarify is, look, like if you're just some random bug bounty hunter, probably using some of these off the shelf tools is not a bad start. But if you're an enterprise that's looking to actually build an ASM that's just gonna hit some of the things you need to do internally and actually is reliable, then you really need to think about this a bit more. And I guess when it comes to engineering, one of the things that's probably most important is the accuracy of the results. And
Mm,
what we find, and what we found over the last 6 years, is getting to that level of accuracy on a very continuous basis comes with a lot of challenges that aren't necessarily related um, directly to the code that you've written or you're running. Sometimes it's often to do with the networking layer. Sometimes it requires you to really reconsider how you architect something or how you do a certain process.
mm,
And the accuracy side of things is not a trivial problem to solve. Actually, like even in just terms of scale, right? The faster you're going and the bigger the scale, the more likely that your accuracy is just not going to be as good as what it is at a smaller scale. And
Yeah.
that's due to various reasons, obviously due to things like timeouts, due to things like networking issues, whatever it may be. But I think that, when a company says to me they're going to be building, and they're not going to be buying, I feel that like they may not consider how much time it's going to take to actually build something that's reliable and performs in the same way as someone that's like a vendor like us that's been doing this for 6 years, that has kind of pretty much ran into all of these issues along the way,
Yeah.
and we've had to solve them. Like we can't like we've had to solve all these issues, and they've been incredibly difficult to solve in many cases, but we've solved them. And this is where I find this whole argument of, internally, we're just going to glue some of these tools together, we're going to pipe it to some Jira tickets or whatever, and we're done. I don't actually think that they're recognizing what is happening under the hood when it comes to what they're missing out on in terms of reliability and quality, as well as, sometimes I feel like they can trivialize the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I think it comes. I mean, there's two elements to it, right? It's if you don't really care about the value and the output at the end of the day, well, what does it matter, right? And you know, I think to your point earlier, if you're a bug bounty hunter, um, you have a different output, right? You have a different you have a different perspective. But one of the big things that we've focused on has always been about, okay, there's value in that approach, right? There's a value in large scale discovery and scanning, and doing that quickly. But how do you make that consumable to the end user, right? To the customers who have to fix this, and I think that's a real part. It's kind of the management part, right, of attack surface management, and it's a part that's sort of forgotten, but it does come from the basis of having accurate and timely results. And I think there's some interesting points to that, right? If you look at it across the board, um, you know whether it's the asset discovery or enrichment sort of side of it, or whether it's the exposure scanning side, there's a lot of challenges there, right? So, like, for example, a lot of tools will just spit out any kind of assets, say subdomain assets that they get from whatever sources that they're checking, right? Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's real. Like, there's lots of challenges there, whether it's like wildcard, DNS wildcards, whether it's assets that don't resolve. Like, if a subdomain doesn't resolve, right? How relevant is that really an asset at this stage, right? And how relevant is that from an exposure monitoring perspective? And so, I think there's that side of it. There's also like really nuanced stuff, right? So if you're looking at doing something like port scanning as an example, and you're a company, right, and you're using a cloud provider, if you're trying to do anything at any kind of scale, you run into heaps of problems, right? So you run into probably the biggest one is sort of accuracy if you're going too hard. We've experienced that on AWS, and you can talk to that. But even just things like abuse requests, right? Around things as simple
Yeah,
as port scanning.
I think that some distinguished engineers might look at the bug bounty space as a bit of inspiration and see all these bug bounty hunters who are automating some of this stuff and say, hey, I can do this too. And this isn't that hard, right?
Yeah,
But let me tell you, there's a huge difference between what these bug bounty hunters are doing for automation versus what you need as an
yeah,
ASM, right? Like, for example, I have a very good friend of mine who's probably one of the best bug bounty hunters, ranked on top 3 on almost every platform. And I know for a fact that some of his methodologies, they work really well for bug bounties. But when it comes to something like an ASM that you need to use for your internal organization, they're not really ideal. Like, for
yeah,
example, just one example, I think one of the things I heard of some time ago was, the way he deals with DNS wildcards, which obviously at Astronaut, we have a very specific way of dealing with that, which we've refined over the last 6 years. But his way is, if I see more than 50 or 100 records under a single subdomain, I just discard all of them, because who
yeah,
cares? And we'll just keep going and we'll keep chugging along, kind of thing. Which, in a bug bounty perspective, he's just making quick decisions to get to the outcomes he wants from a bug
Yeah.
bounty perspective.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way to do it. It means that it's the fastest way to just kind of deal with that problem
Yeah.
without too much annoyance, I guess. And I guess the other thing is, in the bug bounty space, and generally with ASM, we do have a lot of open source tools on the market now. We do have a lot of, I guess, signatures or templates that are written by the community. I don't really think that these templates and signatures have that much quality control, just based on my experience.
Yeah.
And yes, there is definitely some quality control. Like there's a PR process and a review process and so on, but it really doesn't feel the same with as how we do it at Arsonit, to be honest, and how much rigor we
Yeah.
put into it. So, like some of the things I often see is, requests that don't need to happen or are irrelevant entirely, testing software that's never going to exist on the internet, or sometimes worse, when it's testing it in a way that's disruptive, sometimes testing it in a way that doesn't actually lead to the results that you're looking for, sometimes relying on out of band infrastructure that you're not in control of in any way or form, and it's just some third party you got to trust. Which
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, it's the same as us vendors, but it's not the same in the sense that it's some open source tool that
Yeah.
just
It's
has
just
some out
some
of band.
random service
Yeah, you
or
got
a
no
random.
contract with them. You got no nothing. It's just, yeah, you're gonna just use their out of band server.
And
You can
these are
change
all
these
important.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But anyways, there's definitely a huge variance between what bug bounty hunters are building for their tooling versus what you probably need as an enterprise.
Yeah, and then the other side of it as well is just, forgetting some of these, putting aside some of these elements, right? Like the accuracy, the speed and scale. Where do you want to spend your time, right? Like, do you want to be there dealing with these challenges, right? And maintaining this sort of infrastructure, or do you want, as a security engineering team or as a security team, to be focused on the actual output of that, and what do you want to build? Do you want to build custom things on top of a platform that's handling all the scaling, the infrastructure management, dealing with AWS's extreme networking stack restrictions, all that kind of stuff, and then you can just build your sort of logic and your custom stuff on top of it, or do you want to really be maintaining this kind of infrastructure on a day-to-day basis? Like, what's sort of worth your time? And I think what we've seen is that there's a lot of people that have tried that come to that realization eventually, usually like a year or two in.
Yeah, and let's not even talk about all the integrations you need to build. like
Yeah.
let's think about it. If you're going to build an ASM, it's not just there to exist in a vacuum. You've got to have all sorts of attribution information coming from some source in some way or form, like AWS or Azure or whatever it may be. You got to have all the cloud integrations. And like one of the things I find really interesting is, there's a lot of, I guess, I feel like there's a lot of companies, and a lot of times in the build with buy case, people underestimate the scale that they're going to need to
Oh,
go
yeah.
at. Like, I think a lot of our customers that have any of these cloud integrations, they sometimes have thousands of accounts.
Mm.
And I know how much work we've put in to actually get that process to be so optimized in its speed and scale that it
Mm.
can support an unlimited number of accounts. And look, a lot of this stuff sometimes goes all the way back to the architecture and infrastructure choices you choose from the beginning, because you may not even be able to scale it to the speed and scale you need if you haven't made those decisions right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of gotchas with this, and it's not just like you can glue things together.
Yeah, and depending on your attack surface, right? If you want to monitor this continuously, which everybody does because that's the right way to approach it, right? Is your idea of continuous like once a month, right? Or once a week even, it's like maybe that's good enough like for your particular organization. But for most people, you want it to be faster than that, right? And if you've got any kind of scale, not only to your point, are they inefficient? They're sending requests that don't need to be sent. They're potentially disruptive. I mean, these are things that, for better or for worse, bug hunters don't care about, right? When they're using this sort of tooling, against an attack surface. But these are things that the defenders actually do have to care about. They have to think about safety. They have to think about the load, and they have against those assets. They have to think about things like how effective is their sort of time in terms of having to look through and manage the results. How can they consume it to remediate these issues? And so you have to consider all those points, and they're not trivial. And it goes to the consumability of this. And um, I think the idea of sort of build versus buy in terms of what I've seen in this space is just it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where there's so much variance in what people claim is ASM, versus I think what the majority of people want, as sort of the end consumers of this. And they're just sort of being somewhat disillusioned. Like last year we were working with a tech company out of California, and it was one of those stories, like I mentioned earlier, where they were looking around for various products. And basically the gist of his sort of result the result of that analysis was, the ASM market is terrible. It's crap, was the term that he used, right? And he sort of put it out to social media. It's like, before I build my own, because there's literally nothing that serves my needs. Is there anybody else, right? And somebody in the comments, I guess, on that post mentioned us, and that's where he had this sort of epiphany. It's like, this is what I was looking for. And so, like, they're coming at it with a very specific expectation of what they want. And this company, like I mentioned, they're a tech company. They have a strong engineering culture. They could build something, right? It's not like they're completely averse to building something. But they recognized, obviously, that there is a maintenance cost to doing so, and so they were looking at the market, but they just weren't seeing anything that made sense. And so I think there is a bit of this interplay between this idea that the market is so, like, fragmented, and so so kind of confusing for these customers. That drives, well, maybe I should build it myself. Maybe we might get a better outcome if I take some of these open source tools, or take some of this stuff and kind of just hobble it together to try and tick the boxes that I'm trying to get. But then, I think our experience has been that they eventually realize that that's not an effective or sustainable solution at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that it can be really tempting, to build something instead of buy something. But I just realistically seeing some of these security teams that we work with, and a lot of companies in general, I feel like they're really hard strapped for time, and they don't have. I really don't feel like managing an ASM is something that can be done kind of like as a side project or as a part-time thing. It is a pretty full-on thing, even if it's just for a single company. Because as I mentioned earlier, all the same scaling problems that we deal with at Asset Note, or have dealt with already, are still going to hit every other company that tries to deal with this. And look, there are more and more, I guess, ASMs out there now, and because of that variance, you don't know if you're going to be able to find something that fits your needs. But I am finding that and I don't know if this is inspired by us, but I am finding that there is this convergence that at least exposure scanning is
Yeah.
becoming kind of a more common thing in ASMs, I guess, today, which is really, really interesting, because we've been doing that for 6 years, right? So
Oh,
that's
yeah.
not like a new
That,
thing
that
for
was
us.
that was the idea from the get go for Asset Note. And what was interesting is chatting to some of the other big players at the time. Their perspective was like, oh, well, why don't you just build an integration with, like, a vulnerability scanner, and, like, just pass it over? Or isn't it enough just to tell you that you've got this technology running on your attack surface? Isn't that enough, right? Like, that was their mentality. And I was talking to the CEOs and the product leaders at these companies, right? That was their mentality. And we were like, no, that's not good enough. It's not good enough from a signal perspective. It's not good enough in the sense of nobody just wants asset discovery, right? No, like people want it. Like, why? What's the point, right? Just so you've got a list of assets. Like what they want to do is, it is foundational, it is very important, but it's foundational in the sense that it enables other things, right? So if you just think about exposure scanning as a use case, right? um, the idea of, why would you want asset discovery to pipe into a vulnerability scanner via an integration? Well, so you've got coverage of everything, so you're not missing anything. Because what's the point of scanning for security exposures if you're not looking at everything in the first place?
Yeah.
Because you're going to miss out on it, right? So it's for something else, and it's to enable something else, and back in the early days, that was a very radical kind of shift. That I think, to your point, people have been starting to catch up to, right?
Yeah.
People have been starting to come around. I think it's driven by a lot of different things, right? It's driven by just generally customers sort of seeing that in various vendors that are doing that, and they're like, yeah, this is what I want. So it's driven by customers, but it's also driven by a lot of acquisitions in this space. If you look at a lot of the acquisitions that have happened in the ASM space, it's been of those pure play discovery, kind of products, right? That are just doing discovery, and then they're building it into like a larger platform, or other, integrating with other products that already exist, for that exact same purpose, right? It's like, well, these use cases, these things that we want to do, whether exposure scanning, threat intelligence, whatever, it's going to be made better by this, right? And so they're doing the same thing. Like, they're coming at it from the same, they're looking at the same problem, but they're just solving it from different perspectives. So, like, whereas we build it from the ground up and are deeply integrated from the get-go, they're coming at it by acquisitions, so like kind of top down, right? They've already got all these other products, and I think that's kind of changed their thinking, um, for better or for worse, but that's kind of gotten people, on, onto sort of our thinking, I guess, on,
Yeah.
attack surface management is not asset discovery. It's what you do with that. And it's sort of enabling these core processes, with real time, asset awareness, and building that into these core processes. That's the key value point. And you can't do that. You can't do that if these sort of core processes, exposure monitoring, threat intelligence, all, incident response, all those things that you want to do, you can't do that if they're not built with that asset awareness in mind. It's just really like a subpar experience, and so
Yeah.
that's the approach that we've taken, and it has been interesting to see that development. But again, like, the quality of that is across the board, right? So when we take a concept like that, when we talk about asset discovery and exposure monitoring, and the various forms of exposure monitoring that can take, it's so deeply intertwined. Like, when we think about it from an engineering perspective, a product perspective, just our philosophy, like, they're not just standalone things. Like, one feeds into the other and vice versa. But what I'm also seeing, just to your point, it's not just like, end users that are like, oh yeah, maybe I can just run this off the shelf stuff very easily. It's companies, right? That, often they're pen test companies, or companies of that sort of nature, that are more services based, that are trying to, build something that's, I guess, a bit more of a product. And they're doing that, right? Like, they're taking like some really basic asset discovery, and they're just providing scanning with these open source tools, right? Like, I saw one the other day I was looking at, and then they don't even hide it. Like, most people try to hide it. Like, when we find out about it, it's kind of like, oh yeah, like behind the scenes it's just X tool, right? I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But like, these guys were like, no, it's based on their pricing, right? So on your cheapest tier you get open VAS, and on your more expensive tier you get nuclei. It's like, why would you pay for that, right? I don't understand the value that you're actually getting on top of that, especially given that, the output of both of those tools is not great when you start to do things like scale it up, right? Well, like, when, if you've got an asset and there's a couple of false positives, right? On its own, that's not a huge issue to deal with, right? Like, you can just sort of weed them out and ignore them. But what happens when you've got 1,000 assets, or 5,000 assets, 10,000 assets, and there's a few false positives on all of them, right? That's like thousands of results that that are just irrelevant, right? And so what do you want to weed through all of that, right? And then it takes you to run those tools against 10,000 assets. It takes you forever, right? Do you really, is it really that good of an experience? And it's just surprising that people would pay for that, right? Because there's not really much that they're offering on top of that. It just shocked me, right?
Yeah.
So,
You
but
know,
like we're
some of
seeing that
my
just on the vendor side, like not just the bug hunters or the build side, right? We're even seeing it on
yeah.
the vendor side, which is
You know,
kind of crazy.
I still think some of my favorite feedback when it comes to what we've built is that when we release something, they know that it's important, so they're gonna actually look at it, and they're actually gonna spend the time on it. Compared to other tools which are raising thousands of things, and look, you're not wrong. Like a lot of these tools do have thousands and thousands of things they check and look for and raise and things like that, but I do think that they take this approach where they kind of ask you to filter things out in terms of only scan for these things or only filter these things out or whatever it may be. And I think one of the big things, just to go back a little bit on this build us buy and a lot of these competitors that we're seeing that are trying to glue together these open source tools and whatever it may be, is I'm actually I'm actually not sure if they've dealt with some of the issues we have yet, or if they have, they're going to have potentially some customers that do experience a lot of difficulty. Is all the safety side of things that we've had to build, and I know we've got some real war stories there when it comes to that sort of stuff, and we've done a lot of work in terms of building that into everything we do, from the scanning perspective, from everything else. Like for example, let's just say you've got these open source tools and you've got some asset discovery or whatever it may be. It discovers 1,000 new subdomains today, and all of them are pointing to the same place or whatever, and then you just pipe it to your scanning and slam everything that's in those 1,000 assets. Suddenly you've got some sort of outage happening on your internal network or whatever it may be. And these I really don't think these are well thought out in our competitors products. And that's something that I've honestly noticed is these safety elements that are really important to large enterprises or any enterprise really. They're things that we've had to work out and systematically build in our platform. We have multiple different mechanisms of this that we've had to build in the last 6 years. But I don't know if you agree with that. It's just generally I feel that a lot of these competitors, they don't really understand these things, and they may not understand them until it's too late, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of interesting when you look at sort of the landscape, I guess, the overall landscape, and the kind of care and attention that we put into it is kind of interesting. Like to your point earlier, where they talk about but you were speaking about the feedback that we get, right? Where where it's very satisfying when they say that, right? They're like, if something comes out of asset note, I jump on it because I know that it's real. Or, in many cases, they just pipe it straight to the engineers to fix, right? That the security team doesn't even, there's so much trust in it, the security team doesn't have to look at it. And like that sounds really good and really positive, but behind the scenes of that is a ton of work, right? And it's a standard that we're trying to hold ourselves to. So whether it's the signal element or the safety element, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and so it's very validating because and very rewarding because it's like the culmination of that. But yeah, I mean, to your point on safety, I mean, safety is a very important thing, and particularly if you're looking at it from an external attack surface perspective. I mean, we recognize that from the start. In terms of again, like the safety systems that we built to sort of handle different kind of attack surfaces and different kind of edge cases and different configurations of an attack surface that could potentially lead to disruption if it was scanned at any kind of scale. I mean, these are the oldest systems in our platform, right? These were right from the get-go. When we were doing very early testing of asset note, not only were we able to do this on bug bounties, right, but we were also were very fortunate to have a lot of very large companies that we sort of knew that said, hey, like, we're happy for you to sort of test this out against our attack surface. And these are sort of the things that sort of shook out in the first sort of few months of building asset nodes. So they're the oldest systems in our platform, but it is a really important thing. But the one area, I mean, you touched on a few things, but I think the one area that also gets overlooked, in this kind of conversation that we're having, is the design and the approach of the actual checks themselves, right? You have to think about safety and disruption in that as well. And so, when you look at what we do, it's very curated, right? It's very curated in the sense that this is all built by us. It's using technology that's built by us. All of the checks are built and maintained by us. So we take that kind of very seriously. And so not only we've spoken about on other episodes, I guess, in the past about how we think about exploitability and how we think about the quality of that from a security outcome perspective. But to your point around safety, a lot of it is the design of that and how you approach that from a safe perspective. Whereas a lot of tools that are just kind of aggregating open source submissions, there's not really that standard there, and there's stuff that can slip through, um, and that can be a real problem, if you're just relying on that, because I guess the draw of those tools is, oh yeah, well, we've got thousands and thousands of submissions, and we've got thousands and thousands of checks, and so this idea that more equals better is not necessarily true in a practical sense if you care about these things, and if you are looking at scanning your external attack surface, you have to care about these things. Bug bounty hunters, I'll be honest, I think there's quite a few that are pretty like blasé and gung ho when it comes to scanning these programs attack surfaces, right? So they don't care, and like that's fine, right? That's on the program. But these companies, they do have to worry about this. This is their production internet facing attack surface. Things going down is not can be quite impactful, right? It's not nothing. That can lead to significant loss of business and reduction of business, and disruption to operations and things like that. And so it's actually a really critical and important factor, which is why we spend so much time on it and have from the get-go. But when you're just getting something off the shelf, you kind of got to be a bit careful about that, because often you're not getting that same kind of quality and rigor, because the people who are contributing to it, they don't care about that. It doesn't matter to them. Like, it matters to us, but it doesn't matter to them.
And it's funny because given what's happening right now with CrowdStrike and everything, like the fact is that these checks that are built in a lot of these open source tools, especially by the community, can definitely lead to problems. Maybe not a blue screen of death, but definitely problems in terms of their attack surface. There's a lot of techniques that are coming out as well these days that focus on things like cache poisoning and other things like that. And I've definitely seen where this can go wrong, where you actually just completely disable access to a website for a long period of time. So these are things that are definitely happening. But
they're tricky to get right. It's worthwhile. It's worthwhile doing it, right? But you got to do it the right way.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess the let's just say that you're an organization that's decided to build your own ASM, and you do all of this right, and you get through all of this monstrous effort that you have to do. Then you're still going to have to deal with some of the most weird shit you'll see on the internet ever. Like, Mike, like I know we dealt with this, and we're going to be speaking about it at B-Sides Canberra later this year, where we one day we just discovered that if you have any domains that point to a Chinese hosted name server, then there's some real DNS poisoning happening there. And that just completely messes your results. And look, I'm not saying every organization has a presence in China, but any domain that even has a name server in China, even if it's Cloudflare, is still completely screwed in this case. So there's all sorts of things like this. And, we've obviously done a lot of engineering around all of this stuff, but this is the sort of, I guess, experience that we have in this space that we bring into our product compared to others.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess, to some extent that's expected, right? Like, there is a difference between a vendor product that you pay for versus just, open source, tooling that you get off the internet. And I guess,
right, but there are a lot of vendors that are masquerading like this kind of thing. Where they are just That's the interesting part with it. They are just gluing things together. So it's
Yeah,
worth
that's been kind of
identifying.
surprising to me because if you're a company and you're like, okay, well, look, I'm just going to take some open source tooling. Maybe they understand all the things that we're saying. It's like, look, it's not going to be as effective, it's not going to be that great, but like it's good enough for what I want to get off the ground, and it's cheap, right? That's one thing, right? But if they go in the opposite direction, say, well, hang on, I want somebody else to maintain this, I want somebody else to provide this sort of value that can do it better than me, right? That can do it better than just running open source tools, and then they go and pay money for a product and like it's just that behind the scenes. It's kind of nuts. What extra are you really getting? And that's kind
Yeah,
of, it's just disappointing to see. And like, I want to be clear that this is not the totality of the ASM market, right? There are good products out there that do try to approach things, uh, from a better perspective than just gluing tools together, right? And there's other different approaches as well. Some focus very heavily on kind of manual work, right? Which we've obviously are all in on automation, as a more scalable and effective solution. But I mean, that's an interesting kind of approach, right? So it's not to say that like that's everybody but us, but like it's just so prevalent in ASM, right? There's so many sort of Me Too companies that have just spun up, right? And they're just a thin veil over a bunch of open source tools, and it's just why would you, there's no value in that. You're honestly wasting your money, and it's just wild to me how prevalent that is. But that's just me, I guess. Like
yeah,
we obviously build this stuff, and we obviously care very deeply about it.
yeah.
So I guess we're maybe a bit biased there, but yeah, cool. No, I think it's a good discussion. Yeah, and on the DNS issues, the insecurity through censorship, we are presenting that at B-Sides Canberra here in Australia in August. So we won't give too much away. It's a pretty interesting issue. But yeah, is it August that we're presenting, or is it September?
It's the end of September,
End
and
of September.
I guess just the gist for people who are watching, it's possible to exploit almost over 30 million domains on the internet through some client-side attacks, and it's all really possible due to, we believe, some censorship protocols that are in place in China.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously B-Sides Canberra, if you're in Australia, it's a great conference, check it out. But I'm pretty sure they record things, but maybe it's worthwhile after we do that presentation. We might do another session here and like deep dive into it.
Yeah,
That'd
for
be
sure.
maybe pretty interesting. But cool. I think we can wrap it up there, and yeah, chat soon.